But we begin tonight with a wild weekend and the unprecedented challenge to more than 2 decades of Vladimir Putin's grip on Russia. The armed rebellion has ended, but the uncertainty it sparked continues. The Russian warlord behind that attempted insurrection, Wagner Group leader Evgeny Prigozhin, remains out of sight. But he released an audio message today, claiming that he wasn't seeking to overthrow Putin. He called it a protest. But he renewed his criticism of Russia's military, saying his weekend march was a masterclass on how Russia should have carried out its invasion of Ukraine. His rebellion began late Friday after Prigozhin released audio and video messages claiming Putin's invasion of Ukraine was based on a lie. He then slammed Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, accusing him of ordering an airstrike on Wagner forces. By Saturday morning, the Wagner paramilitary troops had moved east from Ukraine into Russia and the city of Rostov-on-Don, a key southern military command center, before pushing north toward Moscow. Prigozhin was last seen in public late Saturday, leaving Rostov-on-Don after he called an end to the uprising and turned back the soldiers he'd sent marching to within 125 miles of the Russian capital. Under a deal to end the revolt announced by the Kremlin, Prigozhin would go to neighboring Belarus, where he and his soldiers would receive amnesty and charges against him would be dropped. But according to Russian media reports, the case against Prigozhin for mounting a rebellion remains open. In his first public appearance since Saturday, Vladimir Putin praised the rank-and-file Wagner mercenaries, but attacked their leader without naming him.
The organizers of this rebellion cannot but understand that they will be brought to justice. Everybody understands that. This is criminal activity, which is aimed at weakening the country, and this was a colossal threat.
Putin followed up with a televised meeting with his defense and security chiefs, including Defense Minister Shoigu, the target of Prigozhin's criticisms. But despite Putin's attempt at showing strength, the weekend rebellion has raised major questions about both his grip on power and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Today, Putin blamed Ukraine and the West for the uprising, saying it is what his international opponents wanted. President Biden, meanwhile, addressing the situation for the first time today, stressed that the U.S. and Western allies had nothing to do with Prigozhin's mutiny.
We gave Putin no excuse to blame this on the West or to blame this on NATO. We made clear that we were not involved. We had nothing to do with it. This was part of a struggle within the Russian system.
President Biden said he'd spoken at length with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who in his own video address over the weekend said Russia's internal turmoil only exposed Putin's weakness.
Today, the world saw that the bosses of Russia do not control anything. Nothing at all. Complete chaos. Complete absence of any predictability. I will say it in Russian. The man from the Kremlin is obviously very afraid and probably hiding somewhere, not showing himself. I am sure that he is no longer in Moscow. He calls somewhere, asks something. He knows what he's afraid of because he himself created this threat. All evil, all losses, all hatred, he himself who spreads it.
Wow. Meanwhile, Prigozhin's mutiny also raises uncertainty about whether Wagner soldiers will remain a force on the battlefield in Ukraine, with analysts saying the Ukrainian military may be able to capitalize on the chaos and weakening Russian morale to make gains. Joining me now from Kyiv, Ukraine, is MSNBC chief correspondent Ali Velshi. Ali, my friend, it is always great to talk with you. This is fascinating. You now have the monster turning on the master, as folks have said. How is that playing out in Ukraine?
In a few different ways, but mostly Ukrainians are sitting there thinking it's probably good for them that their oppressor, that their invader is in some chaos. It's not clear, though, if you were a Ukrainian, just like if you were a pro-democracy Russian, that Prigozhin was going to be a better option than Putin. In fact, Prigozhin's criticism of the Russian army is that it didn't do enough. It's not brutal enough in its war. It's not effective enough in its war. So he wanted a bigger, a more effective effective war in Ukraine. So Ukrainians are happy about a few things. A, there's a crack in the armor in Russia, something that they always believed to be the case. B, those Wagner fighters are mostly not in Russia anymore. Most of them are gone. C, Prigozhin, who was really the tip of the spear in terms of the Russian invasion here, in terms of the ground war that was going on in the east. Obviously, he has nothing to do with the missiles that rained down on Kyiv and the drones. But in terms of that ground war that had drawn out to a stalemate, that was Prigozhin and his men. The reason Bakhmut took so long to recapture was because of Prigozhin and his men. Very interesting that Putin has now accused Prigozhin and his men of being failures in Russia, saying that this was an effort to cover up their failure. So the infighting in Russia, generally speaking, is seen as good for Ukraine. There is one exception, and that is when a strong man is attacked, when a strong man is shown to be weak, what do they then do? In the case of Erdogan in Turkey, when there was an attempted coup against him, he took that as an opportunity to become more autocratic. Well, Putin's already autocratic, so what does he do? Does he rain terror on Ukraine to prove that he's as tough as he is? So there's uncertainty in Ukraine, but generally speaking, they're a few weeks into this spring counteroffensive. They've reclaimed about 130 square kilometers of land. That's not a lot. It's about 10 villages or hamlets, but they are making forward progress, and they were feeling good about that forward progress by last week. And now this has happened. So it tends to be having an energizing effect on Ukrainians, and mostly those Ukrainian troops who've really not just run on Western and NATO weapons and ammunition, but they have run on their own morale and the support in their own country. And that is bolstered today. So for the moment, it's very early to tell. It's early innings in this, but Ukrainians are feeling better than they were last week about the fact that something is very wrong in Russia.
Yeah, I mean, I got to imagine it feels pretty good that the fighters who were actually the most lethal and most effective, they bounced out of there, and now basically they have the disorganized, incompetent, low morale Russian troops left. And I think just based on listening to Zelensky, they feel like they could take them. So I think, yeah, it's a good day to be in Ukraine today. Ali Velshi, can't wait to watch you later. You're going to be on for an hour. You're the hardest working man in show business here is Ali Velshi, because you're going to be on for an hour, full hour, 8 p.m., live from Ukraine, from Kyiv. Thank you, my friend. Stay safe.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you. And it's called Russia in Crisis. So y'all be sure to watch that. But let's really quick keep this going by bringing in former CIA Director John Brennan, MSNBC senior national security analyst, also friend of the show. So, the question that I am dying to ask you, sir, is what did the CIA know and when did they know it? Because, there is, a sense that there was some understanding inside the U.S., inside the CIA, that something was up with the Wagner Group vis-a-vis Russia. To your understanding, is this something that the CIA would have known about, and what would they have wanted it to happen? Is this something where the U.S. was rooting for a coup?
Well, I think, Joy, that I'm pretty confident that the CIA knew a lot more than you and I knew about what was happening inside of Russia and Ukraine. And they were keeping President Biden fully informed as developments were unfolding. And I think we have to show a fair amount of humility in terms of trying to describe what happened over the last several days and also what may happen. But what is very clear is that the situation, I think, is still very unsettled. It's very dynamic. And we don't know exactly what Putin is going to do in order to try to regain control, because clearly his very public admissions about this rebellion and the threat that it posed to the Russian state is unprecedented. And so I think what he's trying to do is figure out now how he can preserve the military capabilities of the Wagner Group in Ukraine and in other places while decapitating its leadership that clearly was engaged in this rebellion against Moscow. But again, I still think we have a lot to learn about why Prigozhin's forces turned back, what type of deal was struck, whether or not Putin is going to follow through on any commitments he might have made in order to get Prigozhin to stand down. So I think the coming days are really going to give us a lot more sense of exactly which way this is going to go. But we should make no mistake about it. Prigozhin is a war hawk. He's a bloodthirsty war hawk. And this is a threat to Putin from his right wing, his hard right wing. And so there are a lot of scenarios here that can still unfold that are not going to be favorable, I think, to our national security interests.
Right. I mean, the reality is, right. I mean, and number one, I got a two-part question for you. Number one, can he possibly keep him alive or out of prison? Right. I mean, he spoke out against the military operation or whatever the euphemism they used for it. He said it was based on a lie. That's supposedly illegal. He's also a threat. He has his own army, and that it doesn't seem like Putin controls it. He controls it. Even though he's out of the country, is it possible that he can even be left alive? So that's number one. And then the second part is, if, let's just say, this coup led to another coup, who would even fill that vacuum? Because we certainly don't want that guy running Russia. He's no better.
Well, Prigozhin clearly became a cult-like figure, certainly within the Wagner Group, which is why I think Putin is not just going to eliminate him immediately, because I think he is trying to make sure that the Wagner Group, which has played such an important role in Ukraine, is going to remain a fighting force. But I don't think that what Prigozhin has done will ever be forgiven or forgotten by Putin. So I think Putin will ultimately exact his revenge against Prigozhin at the time that he deems most appropriate. But if this rebellion was able to move into Moscow, and Putin was pushed out, I think it's unclear exactly who would come to the fore. It probably would be somebody from the right wing of Russian establishment. It'd probably be a cabal initially. I mean, there are some individuals at the top who have been, long-standing advisors and part of the inner circle of Putin. But I think they recognize that they're in the accountability bucket as well. And so I don't think that one of those who are closest to Putin would take over. It might be somebody from the outside, outer ring, military, but somebody who be able to control the military, security, intelligence services. That is so critically important. But again, I don't think we're at that point yet, but we may see it happening in the not too distant future.
Yeah.